wish to switch. So now, without further ado, we'll be getting into the first component of today's event. So now, as you've seen, all of you in the description of the event, we're presenting it in two parts today. So as we often do, we've asked an expert to come in and help us get the conversation started by providing a brief presentation laying out the important concepts, the nature of the problem, some relevant research. And in this case, we're very happy to have with us and fortunate to have with us Professor Alistair Ager, who's the director of the Institute for International Health and Development at QMU in Edinburgh. That's Queen Margaret University in Edinburgh, and also Professor of Population and Family Health at the Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia University in New York. Professor Ager has worked in the field of international development with a particular focus on refugees and IDPs for more than 25 years after originally training in psychology. And he's published widely on the subject of the well-being of humanitarian workers, including a longitudinal study of the adjustment to expatriate workers also studies of national staff in Uganda, Sri Lanka, and Jordan, and a recent analysis of the narratives of workers deployed with MSF. And I know he'll be sharing with us today some of the highlights, the findings of those studies. So an excellent way to get the conversation started today. So we'll turn now to Alistair, and then following his presentation, we'll have a brief Q&A. And then we'll move into introducing our panel and opening up a larger discussion to explore a number of different angles on this issue. So over to you, Alistair, and thanks for being with us.
For your introduction, Anna Harrod, and I always fight shy a little of that word expert, and yes, I have expertise in some of the evaluation of these issues. Measurement of these issues over the last decade or so, but I'm delighted to see so many people involved in the consultation with expertise in a wide variety of ways through service, through humanitarian work, and through management, and through the provision of support services to humanitarians. So I look forward to the subsequent discussion, and my purpose, I think, is really to help frame some of the points that were given in the general briefing for this presentation, this consultation, particularly in response to Brendan's recent posting. And I want to note, for some people of a certain age, that it's remarkable that we're looking at these issues in 2015, actually on the 20th anniversary of a report on the management and support of relief and development workers by the Overseas Development Institute, which was called Room for Improvement. And for reading, some people might enjoy doing a quick Google search to find that document, as I did this morning, to try and take stock, really, how we've progressed over 20 years in terms of these issues. I want to use the images on this opening slide just to shape a little bit about that thinking. So the top left-hand corner is just an image recognizing the demands and the nature of humanitarian work. This actually is a photograph from Sri Lanka, but it could be from any number of humanitarian deployments, situations across the world, and we're recognizing that this is inevitably demanding and stressful work. But we're particularly interested, and that's the second image, the graphs. I'll be presenting something about the way we can understand serving in such environments, either for a short or a longer period, to have on the mental health and well-being of humanitarian workers. And in particular, I think the implications of that for the effectiveness of humanitarian aid. Building on that data, I just wanted to hint at some of the things that will come up, I'm sure, in later discussion, which is the ways of understanding this to improve the management and support of humanitarian workers, whether this be through recruitment practices, briefing practices, support practices, post-assignment briefing. And I've been particularly honoured to work with the Antares Foundation, and Winifred will be speaking a little bit later about that, but a number of organisations that have either directed themselves as humanitarian providers or agencies supporting humanitarian response try to improve, to professionalise the management and support of humanitarian workers. But as Brendan, I think, hinted in his original posting, still much to be done for many agencies. And then, so just to hint at something, that image in the bottom right-hand corner of that screen is I think a remarkable photograph of humanitarian workers at a volleyball tournament in Gulu, taken about 10 years ago, which I think talks about something of the social capital, the connection, the social support that humanitarians have access to and share freely with each other. So although this is a presentation trying to highlight some needs and demands, I also want to respect and recognise the significant resources that humanitarian workers bring and the contribution that they can make in mutual support in terms of improving practice and supporting the development. So Marcus asked me to address 3 particular questions in this initial briefing, and the first one is about how we might understand staff wellness and how it relates to the broader situations of staff security. And I want to do that with a simple model. There are many different ways this could be described, but this is one that we've used over a number of years and that has some assistance for us. We recognise that there are events in the lives of humanitarian workers that are clearly stressful, that this is an environment in which there are many stressors, very demanding circumstances, and we're particularly concerned about those stressors because we recognise that they have impact on the well-being of individuals. Now we can call these stress and strain, or we can call the stressors and then the stress that results in individuals. But basically it's useful to distinguish between both the circumstances, the events that people experience, and then what impact that has on their bodies and on their minds and on their well-being and on their effectiveness at work. Now we clearly know that this is demanding work, and we clearly know that there are many stressors that we can identify. But what we also recognise is that this is not a straightforward cause and effect, that this simple line between stressors and stress, we know there are many things that can affect that relationship, and we've been involved in work that I'll be describing a little later to help understand the various mechanisms that might operate between being in a stressful environment and actually moderating the effects that has on individuals and on the workplace. And that helps us begin to think through the figure, various coping strategies that individuals might bring, or that teams might bring, or team leaders might bring, various protective factors that we know that can make the workplace, although stressful, less impactful in a negative way on the well-being of individuals and the effectiveness of work there. And then broader things about the appraisal of threats, the way that the work is understood, and indeed the culture of an organisation and the support that it provides. So what we're trying to do over the next little bit of discussion is to reflect on what we've learned over the last 10 years or more around how agencies, through their management principles, through their support, how interagency efforts, how individual efforts can all moderate this relationship to protect both the well-being of humanitarian workers and the quality of their work. Now, stresses that we're particularly interested in may include very dramatic, traumatic stresses, and historically that has tended to get the greatest attention, whether this be the witnessing of a murder or a car hijacking, and those clearly are very threatening stressors. But what the research has indicated that there are chronic stressors, the day in, day out challenge of the workplace, that also contribute significantly to challenging the mental health and well-being and effectiveness of work of workers. And another, what could be called secondary trauma, is the stresses of hearing of the circumstances and witnessing the circumstances of others. So we've been looking at those different sorts of issues. In terms of stress, we've been measuring that in terms of anxiety, of seeing that as something which can result as a result of being in stressful environments, and depression as well. PTSD has got significant profile, and we have looked at that, and it's important to look at that. But also the issue of burnout in terms of broader quality of work and longer term working in the field, a key area to understand the equipping or the erosion of the capacity of workers as a result of successive, potentially long-term chronic stressors, making them less and less effective in the workplace. So we're interested in those events and we're interested in those outcomes, but we're particularly interested in the things that are in the middle, the things that we might have some access to, either as human resource personnel or as team leaders or as recruitment workers for agencies, or indeed in terms of team colleagues of others, to know how we can support our colleagues. And these are things like looking at length of service, the role in the organization, issues like team cohesion, organizational support, broader social support, individual coping styles, and in some contexts, the notion of cultural, spiritual, and religious values and the way that can be brought to work. That's a broad framing just to start us thinking about knowing that we're working with people that are working in stressful environments, that is likely to have impact on them measured in a variety of ways, but there are many intermediary factors that we want to understand to be able to improve the well-being of individuals and the effectiveness of their work. So secondly, I just want to go and pick on a couple of studies that I have been involved in with colleagues. I want to just briefly show for the record this slide of some of the key collaborators in this work with the Antares Foundation and the Centre for Disease Control. There has been other similar work being conducted. I want to talk about two particular studies that I think frame the issues that Brendan originally raised in his posting really quite well. And the first one was, as Anhara mentioned, a longitudinal study of expatriate humanitarian aid workers. These are aid workers deploying to a situation for a period in our study, typically around 6 months. And we spoke with them and we conducted surveys with them just before they had deployed, immediately after their deployment when they returned, and then we followed up with them about 3 or 6 months later. And there were a number of, all of those issues that I showed in the previous slide, we were trying to measure both their well-being, but also their experience, their attitudes, and their understanding, and their sense of support from a variety of networks. And this study is available for you to review. I've just expanded the summary there. I'm going to highlight a few of those issues in a moment, but I just want to show you a couple of figures which are really quite powerful, I think, in trying to elaborate some of the consequences of service, humanitarian service on, in this particular case, the mental health, and then the broader sense of burnout of humanitarian workers. So let me just talk to this figure fairly simply. The top left-hand corner is anxiety, and we're measuring a very simple thing here, which is people, the number of people in our sample. We had, as you can see, over 200 people in the sample. But the number of people in the sample that at different times were reporting so many anxiety symptoms that it really would be concerning that that was likely to impact on their functioning. So at baseline, which is green, that top left-hand corner, a relatively small number of individuals were reporting high levels of anxiety. Immediately after deployment on their return, we can see a very, very significant number of people, a much higher number of people reporting anxiety. Then we could see the red line is what we would want to see, is that, okay, if this is stressful, people are very anxious, they're still anxiety provoked on their return, but as the months go by, they settle back a little bit towards what had been the case beforehand. That recovery that we see in follow-up shows that the work has been very demanding on people in terms of anxiety and stress, but as they have returned, it has begun to return towards the normal situation. Not quite at normal, you'll see, not back to the level of the green line, it's still a significant increase, but moving in that direction. The second figure of depression shows a rather more concerning picture, which is that elevation following deployment, but it not resolving 3 to 6 months later. This sense that many humanitarian workers report of, that not only was the situation demanding, but on return, much of the challenges stay with you in terms of the difficulty and the understandings of working. And then the third figure at the bottom of the page, that confirms a similar picture, putting all these data together in terms of general distress. If anything, actually 3 to 6 months later, more people reporting these general symptoms of anxiety and depression than even of those immediately on return. So that's a concern. And let's look at it in terms of something more obviously linked to workplace effectiveness, and that's in terms of burnout. That's on the second half of the page. And here we're looking at three elements of burnout. The DP on the top right-hand corner is depersonalization. This is something that many humanitarian workers report on with significant concern, that they have found that they have begun to behave in a more cold way in terms of beneficiaries. To survive, they've had to put barriers up, and they feel that they are no longer emotionally connected to the work in the way that they would wish to. And you can see that this levels of depersonalization increased in our sample for those through humanitarian work, and again that those levels of depersonalization were retained even some months after follow-up. Emotional exhaustion is the second line, the second block of text there, and that again reflects this pattern of individuals coming back from deployment emotionally exhausted, but still reporting high levels of emotional exhaustion some months later. And in terms of personal accomplishment, that last area, not so much change across the three periods. So I want to suggest that this provides sound scientific backup for what many humanitarian workers talk of, which is of the challenging and transformational nature of humanitarian deployment, which results inevitably in significant stress within the field, within the time of deployment, but much of that remaining with you either on return or indeed on now a subsequent deployment, with obvious impacts in terms of, for example, that burnout data in terms of the quality of work on a subsequent deployment. One of the huge, I'm actually going to jump over this slide because of the shortage of time, but it's self-explanatory, but really talking about a similar issue about changes in life satisfaction for expatriate workers. So to summarize that slide I showed earlier, I just want to underline what we were finding. Higher levels of chronic stress during deployment led to significant increases in depression and increased risk for burnout, etc. But the more positive thing I want to emphasize towards the end of the presentation is that those with higher levels of social support were associated with lower levels of depression and lower levels of psychosocial distress and higher levels and greater life satisfaction. So we're beginning to see that there are steps that can decrease chronic stresses and strengthen social support networks. So in terms of that initial diagram, it isn't inevitable that exposed to high levels of stressors, one will have these consequences, but there are things that can begin to moderate that relationship. I want to go on briefly, and then I want to sum up just to a second study, because although we were very pleased to talk about first study, many of us felt somewhat embarrassed that we were focusing on perhaps 10% of humanitarian workers which are expatriates, and clearly there are major stresses of deployment in that time, but we're all aware that 90% of humanitarian workers are national staff drawn from their own communities. And the second study I want to briefly touch on, looking at similar issues, was an exploration of that area. This was the three studies. The one I want to report on is the one in northern Uganda, and here this was of nearly 300 national staff talking about the chronic stresses that they were exposed to. The economic financial problems may be understandable, but 60%, 59.3, signalling tensions due to inequality of treatment between expatriates and nationals. 57% feeling powerless because of the situations of beneficiaries, but also challenges around separation from close relatives and other things. So chronic stressors to go along with a picture of personal trauma exposure, which is what this diagram is around. So these are life-threatening exposures. This isn't the chronic day in, day out stressors. These are the very acute ones that are particularly demanding. And the number of exposures, the number of times in one's life that one has witnessed these events at close hand. And I just want to signal that in all of our sample working in Gulu at this time, then the largest proportion, about 40% of people had witnessed at least 1 to 4 of these life-threatening events. Those that were of a Choli ethnicity, and this is actually a proxy for those people who were born and brought up in this area, not deployed from other parts of Uganda, but born and brought up there, and had between 5 and 9 lifetime events in this way. And just in terms of this diagram, this compares very similarly to in fact, is higher levels of lifetime experience of traumatic events than those that we measured in an Iraqi sample of refugees that had fled the conflict in Iraq. So this national staff survey indicated many people with long-term chronic stressors, but also very, very acute stressors. In terms of support, strong social support. The largest proportion of people reported very, very strong support from colleagues. Team cohesion, you can see the line above, rather more moderate. Tensions within the team often contributing to greater difficulty. And rather sadly, very weak appraisals of organisational support, not just in terms of counselling, but more generally in terms of good management, good clarity of roles, and good general support. This work led us to make the following conclusions. I'll reveal them all rather than, whoops, if I can go back one, reveal them all just to show this. So the workers who had the highest levels of exposure to chronic stresses relating to both the setting and the work environment. So these are stresses that are not just inevitable in the situation, they're things that are potentially addressable within the work environment. For example, inequality in treatment between, the sense of injustice of inequality of treatment between national and expatriate staff is something that can be potentially addressed within the workplace. Over 50% of national staff had 5 or more categories of severe exposure to traumatic events. And then you'd seen from the earlier report very high levels of these colleagues reporting high levels of depression, nearly 70% of the sample, 53% reporting anxiety symptoms that would be associated with real interruption of the quality of work, and up to 26% of the population, the humanitarian workers, having so many symptoms associated with PTSD that again it's likely to be interrupting the quality of their work. But the better news, when we look at the moderators, those with less exposure to chronic stress, those with some relief of workplace stresses, showed less anxiety. Those with higher levels of social support were less likely to be anxious and less likely to show burnout. Looking at the provision and the capacities of national staff working with national NGOs compared to international NGOs, national NGO staff were much more vulnerable. And perhaps the simplest and the most important take home from these studies is that last bullet point. Stronger team cohesion, something within the grasp of effective team management and good leadership was associated strongly with a lower risk of burnout. So many of these factors may be seen as challenging to address, but some of them are clearly within the remit of effective organizational management. I want to close just by touching on something that I think the discussion panel will inevitably explore is, well, why has the humanitarian system not responded to this sort of data or this sort of experience that is now backed up by this sort of data more effectively over the last 20 years? I want to suggest 3 areas that have been posited. One, all of which I think, as you can see from the foot of the table, I think are now being eroded as a justifiable base for lack of action. One is the structure of humanitarian work, short-term contracts, insecure funding, and the challenges in really having a sustained understanding of duty of care to humanitarian workers that may be on 3-month or 6-month or 1-year contracts rather than in continuous employment with organizations. I think increasingly that is not an acceptable basis for not understanding organizational commitments over the short term, which often do extend to a longer term, and ways of organizing response and support for humanitarian workers who may deploy with different agencies over a different period of time, but within a coordinated approach can access longer term supports. The second bullet point is the prevailing culture of humanitarianism, and I was struck by, in Howard's notes covering this seminar, almost sort of having to emphasize that this is an issue not because humanitarian workers are selfish and concerned for themselves, but because this has implications for their beneficiaries. And it's that sense of humanitarian organizations having to show such impact on beneficiaries that resources dedicated to delivery, which basically means resources dedicated to supporting humanitarian workers themselves, almost has been seen as a luxury rather than an inevitable part of the work of an effective organisation. And I think that's changing, and the work around the way that humanitarian workers can self-organise, can jointly organise, and can come together, I think he's now challenging both the culture within organisations, which can see good staff care as a luxury rather than a necessity, and indeed challenge donors to see that their obligations to support humanitarian workers in the longer term is part of their being able to sustain quality of interaction over long term. And finally, the lack of evidence that, well, is this not just anecdotal? And I think we're beginning to be able to mobilise evidence that this is a serious challenge to the effectiveness of humanitarian work through eroding the capacities and the well-being and the general capability of humanitarian workers that are a precious asset that have been trained and supported, and to support them effectively in their work is something that is a requirement. So I hope that raises some issues for further discussion. Marcus has signalled that you're very free to download that PowerPoint, and please follow up on the references that are marked there, and I hope that's helpful for subsequent discussion.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Alistair, for getting us started with that presentation. And we have a couple of questions for you. So following just directly on your presentation, a couple of brief questions, and then we'll be moving into a wider discussion. But first, for Alistair, we had a question from Yael, who was wondering if in your research in this area and your experience in this area, speaking with the different actors involved and looking into the resources available, have you found any information, any useful information regarding the budgets that humanitarian organizations are currently putting toward this kind of staff support? So when we're talking about resources being put into this area, have you found any work that's being done to look into the actual budget percentage that's going towards staff support? Second question is from Anne. Anne is wondering, is there a generally accepted definition of burnout? So in the study that you were describing, we saw that there were 3 different aspects of burnout that you were looking at. For those of us who are not deeply familiar with the subject matter, is this a generally accepted way to look at study of the phenomenon of burnout? So over to you, Alistair.
Thanks, Anne-Harrod. So for Yale's question, systematically, no, I don't know of work, and it may be that subsequent panelists have more insight into this, but I've looked at budget committed. I do anecdotally know of 2 sorts of issue. One, I won't name the organisation, but within the last 10 years, a significant investment in developing a staff wellness program, which I thought was quite groundbreaking, and then in a new organizational regime, that budget was really cut and the program disbanded because it was seen to be a luxury and not supporting directly the bottom line of effectiveness. And despite advocacy within the organization, without that was a sad example of both an innovation and a reversal of that innovation, which I think reflects the ambiguity of being able to see this as a key line item. The question is very relevant to not apologize about this as a line item, but to see as a key HR investment in terms of a challenging to manage workforce. I can see from a number of the comments in terms of its fluidity and in terms of short-term contracts. But in terms of broader interagency organisation, which there has been efforts to try and coordinate HR management practices across the major humanitarian NGOs, there is some potential for a more coordinated response which sees that investment in staff training, staff support, staff care is in the long term a sound investment rather than anything that is in any way inappropriate. On burnout, and I think burnout is an important issue because it does somehow speak to both individuals but also managers in a clearer way. I'm not saying anxiety and depression and PTSD are unimportant, but burnout is often seen as a more accessible notion, to where very capable staff are beginning to not function capably because of a number of experiences they've been through. And the model that we have used is actually a fairly well accepted one, which is really these three elements which just subjectively make sense, which is that this element, the emotional exhaustion, I think is fairly clear, of people being burnt out because you can't have the energy anymore to be committed in the way that they previously were. The depersonalization is that element of being brusque and cutting oneself off from concerns in a way that is often disturbing to colleagues, but you can see as a way of coping with a difficult situation. And the broader sense of personal accomplishment is the sense that you don't become proud of your work in any way. So those three elements, there are different understandings of burnout, but I think those are common to most understandings of different elements, which are slightly different in different individuals, what will be more prominent, but the three together really do clearly result in a less effective worker and clearly a significant challenge in being redeployed if you're in a situation where you're reporting challenges in any of those areas, and certainly all three.